So if we are talking about how GDP is measured, there's a couple ways. So we know what GDP is, hopefully. GDP is the market value of all final goods and services produced in a geographic area in a specified period of time. We now hopefully also know what a recession is. You might have some idea that a depression is just a really long and severe recession. So the next question would be, how do we actually go about measuring this? Now, you could just get all prices and quantities of goods that are sold, final goods, and that's in effect what we're going to be doing here. So the one way is looking at what people spend their money on. So we're going to add up consumption spending. So we're going to take the total amount that people spend on consumption, and again, figuring out actually doing this, calculating all of the purchases that people make of final goods. Whew, that makes my brain hurt. So let's assume there are really smart people out there who are doing this. So we're going to add up the amount that is spent on consumption, all services and new products that private individuals spend their money on. Again, that they spend their money on as final goods, not as goods that they spend or services that they spend their money on as intermediate goods. So if I were to buy a 3D printer to print minis for my board games, that would be in consumption. On the other hand, if I were to buy that 3D printer to print goods that I'm going to sell on Etsy, it would actually probably should be viewed as an intermediate good. So all services and new products that private individuals spend their money on. We also then have investment, and this here would be deferred consumption that will hopefully yield greater future consumption. In other words, what's happening? Now, right now, we're assuming that investment and savings are the same thing, which we will relax that assumption here in a bit. So, I could take my income and spend it on buying things, or I could defer my consumption and invest it in other things, with the idea being that that will yield greater consumption in the future. So we have C plus I. Then we're going to add in G. G is government. C plus I plus G, SIG. And then we're going to add in exports, which should be familiar to us, right? And then we're going to subtract out imports. Now, why do we have to subtract out imports? Well, why do we have to add in exports? Well, if we think about it, exports are goods that were produced domestically, but that are not being consumed domestically. And so since GDP is a measure of production, we need to add in the value of exports, or else we will be undercounting the value of production. By the same token, we subtract out imports because that's the value of goods that were produced elsewhere and are now being consumed in the United States. Now, if our data actually just gave us the amount that people spent on domestic goods, in other words, C or I, we wouldn't have to subtract out imports. However, the way that data actually works is we simply get data on how much people consumed, not how much domestic goods and foreign goods they consumed, which means that we have to subtract out imports simply because they are already being counted and we need to subtract them, or else we will be overestimating well-being. So that's our spending identity. That's the main one we're going to be using, and the way I remember it is just SIG-EXIM. And the nice thing is, by now, you should be able to remember X minus IM from international finance, from our current account. So C plus I plus G plus X minus IM. Now, there's a couple of issues here with this piece right here. And what are those issues? Well, one issue is, what's the market value of government goods and services? Or what's the market value of an M1 Abrams tank? We know what government spends for an M1 Abrams tank, but do we know what the market value is? No. Again, why? Because people aren't weighing the costs and benefits of their action. So that's one issue. One problem is, what's the market value? We actually are measuring expenditure here rather than value. Incidentally, it turns out that historically the people who were working on GDP actually wanted to subtract G, basically viewing G as a cost. The resources that were consumed providing decent institutions and national defense were resources that can't be used for something else. In other words, if we were to hold constant the institutions, we would want to minimize G, not maximize G. The issue, of course, was that this was in the 1930s when we were starting to develop GDP, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt was looking for an excuse to get involved in World War II. Americans after World War I were fairly reticent to get involved in another foreign war, but he really thought that we needed to, and he was looking around for reasons why. And one thing he was arguing was that this was going to help stimulate the economy to get us out of the Depression, which frankly was the only reason that was a depression was because of FDR. He was erratic. He was changing policies all the time. He was threatening to nationalize things, basically dramatically decreased the incentives for people to invest in and use effectively the factors of production. There's ample evidence that by 1933, America was already coming out of the Great Depression. It was not basically the Great Depression. It would have been a somewhat severe recession, but FDR's policies and erratic behavior basically plunged us into a depression because people were not willing to invest because they were being threatened with nationalized industries. So that's a side note. However, G here, he was looking for a reason to get involved in World War II. Now, if you think about what would be necessary to, if say G entered in a negative fashion, which analytically it probably should, we should actually probably subtract G, then wartime production is almost certainly going to decrease GDP. And what he wanted to do was find a way for it to increase GDP. And so really as an artifact of a president's predilection to get involved in a foreign conflict, we are stuck with G being positive when in fact analytically it probably should be negative. This also explains why we have that big hump during World War II. Despite the fact that Americans are almost certainly worse off during World War II, the GDP figures show an improvement. So that's one problem, is that this probably should be negative, and instead it's positive. The other issue, then the second issue, of course, was what's the market value? We don't know. We're measuring expenditure rather than market value. And so is that an overestimate or an underestimate? It's unclear, actually. It's really unclear. We could very well be over, right? We could be spending more than the value of things. In the private sector, we understand that's not going to happen. If I'm giving up more than I'm getting out of something, I'm almost certainly going to stop. I'm not going to keep doing it. The marginal benefit being less than the marginal cost, I'm going to desist. But when government officials are making the decision, they're not bearing the costs. They're also not getting the benefits. So there's no reason to think that we're anywhere near the optimum. So that analytically is another question. So we got the one, it should be negative. And the second is we're dealing with expenditure. The third one is more of a practical issue. And the third one is that we need to deal with G net of transfers. In other words, we need to take out subsidies, we need to take out Social Security payments, we need to take out Medicare and Medicaid, we need to take out all of the government expenditure that is transfers. Now, as we are coming up on a stimulus bill that the Congress is passing, one of the things they are at least considering is sending all Americans a check, right, for $1,000 or $2,000, and I don't think it's going to be all Americans, it's going to be some subset of Americans, but say they send out $1,000 checks. So, should that be counted in G? Well, it's going to be counted in the government budget. It's going to be counted in government expenditure. However, it should not be counted in the G that is in GDP. You might ask, well, why not? And the reason is because people are going to do something with that money. What are people going to do with those checks? What do people do with their Social Security checks? What do students do with their student loans, right? Well, they either spend them on consumption or they spend them on investment. And so, in effect, transfers we have to take out of G because otherwise we would be counting them in both G and in C and I. C or I, right? Or both. Does that make sense? I know you can't answer, but hopefully that makes sense. it's just a practical issue, whereas the other two are kind of analytic issues. What's the market value and the fact that it should be negative? The net of transfers is simply saying we can't be double counting things. It's just the same reason we have to subtract out imports, is because government transfers are already counted in consumption and or investment spending. Okay, so that's one way in which GDP is calculated. Another way in which GDP is calculated, and these should be the same, although they may diverge, and that divergence, if we have enough time in the semester, it turns out the divergence between the spending identity and the income identity will actually tell us something. So the other way of doing this is, instead of measuring what everybody spends their money on, we can measure where that money is coming from. Basically, the idea would be, in a competitive market, the factors of production are paid their marginal productivity. And so here we would look at the income, and we could look at the amount that people are making on their wages, and we could look at what's being paid for rent, both rent for capital equipment and rent for properties and buildings, etc. And we can look at interest payments. And that's pretty much it, I think. Now, again, is that pretty complicated to go measure? Oh, nope, I forgot profit. So, corporate profit. So we add all those up, and that needs to be pretty much that, right? That would be the market value of the production, because, again, the factors of production are getting paid their marginal product in a competitive market. So this is, again, assuming we have a fairly competitive factor market, and so this and the spending identity should largely be the same. Now, as I mentioned, the main one you're going to see in this class, and the main one that you're going to deal with, is SIGEXM, C plus I plus G plus X minus M, which is the spending identity. This is the income identity, should be pretty much the same. However, having both of them can be actually useful. Okay, so if we look at this, components, long-term averages versus in 2007. I haven't updated this in a while. This probably should be figure 6.6 or 6 something. Basically, in 2007, consumption was a little bit higher than its long-term average, but not a lot. Basically, 2/3, pretty close to 2/3 of GDP is consumption. And about 15% or 16% long-term average is investment. Government spending is around 20%. And again, I think it would be an easier case to make that we should keep government in check if we had analytically followed the suggestion of the original folks, and that this 20% was a negative instead of a positive. And then we have net exports. And as we mentioned, the United States traditionally has run a trade deficit. In other words, imports more than we export. Again, I think that's a wonderful thing if we can get away with it. Net exports in 2007 were a little bit higher than their long-term average. And again, remember that this government here, this $2.7 trillion in 2007, was net of transfers. And that needs to always be the case. All right. So let me take a quick break here and get some water, and then we can talk about some problems with GDP or issues with GDP, and I'll be right back.